Chin. My parents swore to seize my home for my brother or destroy me. Then my lawyer laughed. Van Dyke. Bomi the se tuak dotengoi na kwa tua cho entre ho kui hoi tua. Saudulat su kwa tua de bat koi. Thumbnail text. When my parents vowed to destroy my life unless I signed my home over to my brother, my lawyer laughed, and I was finally free. Their ultimate punishment shocked the entire family. Van Dyke. Kai bomi the se hui hoi kuok doi tua tru kai tua kai ji chien na cho entre, lutsu qua tua de bat koi, va tua koi kung kung duok tu du. Hin fat koi kung dan cho ho de lam cia gia din soc. When my parents vowed to destroy my life unless I signed my home over to my brother, my lawyer laughed, and I was finally free. Their ultimate punishment shocked the entire family. Your brother needs that house more than you do, Nora. And if you do not sign the deed over by Friday, we will see you in court. We will take everything you have. My father's voice, harsh and commanding, crackled through the high-end speakerphone sitting in the center of the massive mahogany desk. For a split second, I felt that familiar, icy grip of panic tighten around my chest. I was 34 years old, a grown woman with a solid career and a life I had built from absolute scratch, yet that specific tone of my father's voice instantly transported me back to being a terrified teenager. It was the voice of absolute authority, the voice that always meant I was in trouble, that I was failing, that I was being utterly selfish for simply existing. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair so hard my knuckles turned white. I was waiting for the inevitable crushing weight of guilt to fall over me. But the crushing weight never came. Instead, the heavy silence in the office was broken by a sound I completely did not expect. It was a snort. A very distinct, highly amused snort. I looked across the desk at Valerie, my attorney. Valerie was a woman known in Portland for being as unyielding as a titanium vault. She wore impeccably tailored suits and usually maintained an expression so neutral it could freeze water. But right now, Valerie had one hand covering her mouth, her shoulders literally shaking as she tried to muffle a genuine burst of laughter. The legal threat that was supposed to terrify me into complete submission, the grand ultimatum that my father, Raymond, thought would make me crumble, had just become the funniest thing this high-powered attorney had heard all week. My mother, Brenda, chimed in on the call, her voice shrill and defensive. She asked what was so funny and stated loudly that they knew their rights. Valerie took a deep, composing breath, straightening her blazer as she leaned toward the small black speaker. She introduced herself smoothly and informed my parents that the call was being recorded. She then asked, in a tone dripping with polite venom, on what exact legal grounds they planned to sue their independent adult daughter for a property she purchased entirely with her own money. The silence on the other end stretched for so long I genuinely thought my parents had hung up the phone. Then my mother started stammering about how they raised me, how I owed them for feeding and clothing me, how family takes care of family, and how my brother Logan was struggling. Valerie interrupted her right there. She stated coldly that raising a child is a basic legal and moral obligation, not a financial debt to be collected 30 years later. She told them to proceed with their lawsuit and that she had not had this much entertainment in a very long time. My father sputtered a few choice curses before the line went completely dead. Valerie turned to me, the amusement fading from her sharp eyes, replaced by a fierce, protective seriousness. She told me they were going to regret making that threat. She asked me if I was fully prepared for what was going to come next, because once we fired back, there would be no putting the pin back in the grenade. I looked out the large glass window of her office, watching the gray Portland rain fall against the glass. I thought about my home. I thought about the years of being pushed into the dirt. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the panic completely leave my body, replaced by a strange, burning calm. I told her I had been preparing for this war my entire life. I just didn't know it until today. To understand why my parents felt so incredibly entitled to steal my home and hand it over to my brother, you have to understand the deeply twisted dynamic of the family I grew up in. In our household, there were two very distinct realities. There was Logan's reality, and there was mine. Logan is 2 years older than me, and from the moment I could form memories, it was violently clear that he was the golden child, the prince who could absolutely do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the shadow daughter. I was the backup plan, the workhorse, the one who was expected to be completely self-sufficient so that all the family's emotional and financial resources could be funneled directly into keeping Logan happy. It wasn't just a mild preference, it was a psychological conditioning campaign that lasted for decades. Whenever Logan failed, and he failed often, it was always someone else's fault. When he flunked out of his first year of college because he spent all his time partying, my mother blamed his professors for being too strict. When he wrecked his first car, a car my parents bought him outright, my father blamed the weather conditions, even though the police report clearly stated Logan was speeding recklessly. Logan never faced a single consequence. He never had to feel the sting of his own terrible decisions. My reality was entirely different. My parents always told me that I was the strong one, the resilient one. As a teenager, I actually thought this was a compliment. I thought they were proud of my independence. But as I grew older, I realized resilience was just their code word for neglect. It meant they didn't have to help me because I would somehow survive anyway. When it was time for me to go to college, there was suddenly no money left. I was told that Logan's ongoing education, his third attempt at a different school, was a priority and that I needed to take out student loans and find a job. So I did. I worked shifts smelling like cheap diner grease, serving coffee to truckers at 5 in the morning before going to my classes. I saved every single penny. I never asked my parents for a dime because I knew exactly what the answer would be, accompanied by a heavy sigh and a lecture about how selfish I was to stress them out when they were already so worried about Logan. They trained me to believe that my needs were an inconvenience. They gaslit me into thinking that asking for basic support was an act of extreme selfishness. Every time I achieved something, it was immediately downplayed or ignored so that Logan wouldn't feel bad about his own lack of progress. Over the years, this constant emotional manipulation solidified into a deep-seated belief that I was fundamentally worth less than my brother. I internalized their neglect. I convinced myself that I just needed to work harder, be quieter, and demand less. I watched Logan bounce from job to job, from apartment to apartment, always bailed out by my parents' endless bank account, while I counted my pennies at the grocery store to make sure I could pay my electricity bill. By the time I hit my late 20s, I was exhausted. I was so deeply tired of waiting for a scrap of validation that was never going to come. I realized that if I wanted a foundation, if I wanted a safe place in this world, I was going to have to build it with my own 2 hands, entirely alone. 5 years ago, when I was 29 years old, I finally saved up enough money for a down payment. It took a decade of aggressive saving, of skipping vacations, of driving a car that barely ran, and of living in tiny apartments with terrible roommates. I bought a house in a neglected, run-down suburb of Portland. It was an original 1920s craftsman, and calling it a fixer-upper would be the understatement of the century. Everyone who looked at it said it was a teardown. The roof leaked, the paint was peeling like terrible sunburn, the overgrown yard looked like a haunted forest, and the floorboards groaned under every single step. It smelled distinctly of damp earth and 50 years of neglect. When I showed the listing to my family, their reaction was exactly what I should have expected. My mother came to see it once, stood on the porch, and refused to step inside. She pinched her nose and told me I was making the biggest financial mistake of my life. She called it a garbage dump, a money pit that was going to ruin my future. My father laughed and offered to introduce me to a nice apartment manager he knew downtown, suggesting I wasn't capable of handling a property. Logan simply sneered, asking why I wanted to live in a slum when I could just rent a nice place like he did. They didn't see the potential. They didn't see the solid bones of the structure underneath the rot. But I did. For the first time in my life, I looked at something broken and saw exactly what it could become with enough care and hard work. The first winter in that house was the hardest thing I have ever endured. I had drained my savings for the down payment and the closing costs, which meant I had absolutely zero budget left for professional contractors. I lived on a cheap air mattress in the only room that didn't have a leaking ceiling. I heated my soup on a tiny camping stove. The house had no central heating, and Portland winters bite right through your bones. I would sit on the freezing hardwood floors late at night, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets, watching endless hours of internet video tutorials on my phone. I learned how to strip century-old wallpaper using a steamer and a scraper until my hands were blistered and bleeding. I learned how to solder copper pipes because the old plumbing burst during a freeze. I remember crying out of pure frustration one Tuesday at 3 in the morning when a pipe wouldn't seal, covered in dirty water and shivering. But I also remember the overwhelming, indescribable feeling of victory the next day when I turned the valve and the pipe held. I remember taking the first hot shower in a bathroom that I had completely repiped myself. It felt like standing in a waterfall of pure triumph. I spent every single weekend and every evening after work sanding, painting, replacing fixtures, and bringing that old house back to life. I poured my literal blood, sweat, and thousands of tears into those floorboards. That house was no longer just a piece of real estate. It was a physical manifestation of my independence. It was the only place in the world where I felt completely safe, where no one could tell me I was a burden, where no one could make me feel small. I had resurrected that house, and in doing so, I had resurrected myself. Time has a funny way of changing people's perspectives, especially when money is involved. Over the next 5 years, the neglected suburb I had moved into began to rapidly change. It started slowly, a trendy coffee shop opening up on the corner, then an artisanal bakery, and before I knew it, the entire neighborhood was gentrifying. The rundown houses on my street were being flipped by developers and sold to wealthy young professionals. Suddenly, my garbage dump, the house my family had endlessly mocked, was sitting in one of the most highly desirable zip codes in the city. Property values skyrocketed. The house I had purchased for practically nothing was now appraised at over $500,000. As the value of my home increased, so did my family's sudden, intense interest in my living situation. It started with subtle, passive-aggressive comments during mandatory family dinners. My mother would look at me across the table and sigh dramatically, saying it was such a shame that a single woman was hoarding so much space all to herself. My father started making offhand remarks about how much equity I was sitting on and how selfish it was to keep all that wealth locked up when family members were struggling. The family member struggling, as always, was Logan. Logan was now 36 and engaged to a woman named Sierra. Sierra was pretty, polished, and had incredibly expensive tastes. She liked designer bags, weekend trips to wine country, and upscale dining. Logan, desperate to impress her and maintain the illusion of being a successful, wealthy man, was drowning in debt. He was renting an overpriced luxury apartment downtown that he absolutely could not afford. The facade was crumbling and his wedding was approaching fast. He needed a permanent solution to his financial crisis, and he needed a home that matched the lifestyle he was faking for his soon-to-be wife. The subtle hints from my parents quickly evolved into blatant demands. During a Sunday lunch, my mother finally said the quiet part out loud. She suggested, with a sickly sweet smile, that since I had done such a nice job fixing up the house, it would make the perfect wedding gift for Logan and Sierra. She reasoned that I could easily sell it, give the house or the profits to Logan to help him start his new family, and move back into a sensible one-bedroom apartment where I belonged. I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity. I told her absolutely not. I reminded them of the years of work, the freezing winters, the money I had poured into every single room. My father slammed his fist on the table, raising his voice. He told me I was being an ungrateful, stubborn child. He said family makes sacrifices for one another, and that Logan needed a real home to raise children in, something I clearly wasn't going to be doing anytime soon. The pressure campaign had officially begun. They texted me constantly, they sent my aunts and uncles to guilt-trip me, they tried to wear me down just like they always did. They believed I was still the scared little shadow daughter who would eventually cave under their anger. But my house was my fortress, and I was absolutely not going to surrender it. The breaking point, the moment the fragile glass house of my family's lies finally shattered, happened at Logan and Sierra's engagement party. It was a lavish affair held at a boutique hotel downtown, funded entirely by my parents' seemingly bottomless bank account. The room was loud, filled with Sierra's glamorous friends and my pretentious relatives. I was sitting quietly in a corner, nursing a glass of cheap champagne that was masquerading as an expensive vintage, counting down the minutes until I could politely leave. I was purely there out of obligation, wearing a forced smile while my relatives ignored me. Towards the end of the night, Logan stumbled over to my corner. He was heavily intoxicated, his tie undone, his eyes glassy and aggressive. He leaned heavily against the wall, sloshing his drink onto the carpet. He looked me up and down with absolute disdain and started ranting about my refusal to give him the house. He slurred his words, telling me I was a miserable, bitter spinster who cared more about bricks and wood than her own flesh and blood. I tried to stand up to walk away, not wanting to cause a scene, but he blocked my path. Then, with a cruel, mocking laugh, he dropped the bomb. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale whiskey, and sneered. He said I was just jealous because he was getting married and moving up in the world while I was stuck. Then he said it. He said, "At least I didn't blow my entire trust fund on a garbage dump in the ghetto like you did. You got your money and wasted it. Now you're just being greedy." I froze. The loud music in the room seemed to suddenly fade into a low hum. I stared at his flushed face, my brain violently trying to process the words he had just spoken. "Trust fund," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Logan, what trust fund?" He rolled his eyes, laughing again, thinking I was playing dumb. "The trust fund Grandma Martha left us, you idiot. The money we got when we turned 25. Mom and Dad said you blew yours fixing up that stupid house. That's why you're broke and won't help me now." A cold, heavy dread dropped into my stomach. My grandmother, Martha, had died when I was 22. We had been incredibly close when I was a child. But shortly after she passed, my parents sat me down in their living room with somber faces. They told me that Grandma Martha had changed her will at the very last minute. They told me she was deeply disappointed in my life choices, that she thought I lacked ambition because I was working in a diner to pay for community college instead of attending a prestigious university like Logan. They told me I had been completely disinherited. It had broken my heart. I had mourned the loss of her love more than any money. I looked at Logan, who was now stumbling away to rejoin his friends, completely unaware of the massive earthquake he had just triggered in my reality. I left the party immediately. I drove back to my house in complete silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. For 9 years, I had believed my grandmother died ashamed of me. For 9 years, I had struggled, starved, and exhausted myself to survive. If Logan was telling the truth, if there actually was a trust fund that I supposedly spent, then my entire life, my poverty, my struggles, had been engineered by a massive, devastating lie. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room I had built, realizing that my family was not just toxic. They might actually be monsters. The morning after the engagement party, I didn't call my parents to confront them. Confrontation without proof with people who have mastered the art of gaslighting is a fool's errand. They would simply call me crazy, tell me Logan was just drunk and talking nonsense, and turn the situation around to make me the villain. I knew I needed hard, undeniable facts. I spent hours researching online until I found Victor. Victor was a private investigator whose reviews described him as a relentless bloodhound, a man who specialized in tracing hidden assets and digging up buried financial histories. I took a sick day from work and drove to Victor's office. It was a modest, slightly messy room filled with filing cabinets, smelling faintly of stale coffee and old paper. I sat across from him and told him the entire story. I told him about the alleged disinheritance 9 years ago, the house, the sudden demands from my parents, and Logan's drunken slip of the tongue. Victor listened quietly, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he looked at me with sympathetic but sharp eyes. He told me that in his experience, drunk people rarely invent complex financial lies out of thin air. They usually just leak the truth they are trying to hide. I paid his hefty retainer fee using the emergency savings I kept for house repairs. What followed were 3 of the most agonizing, psychologically torturous weeks of my life. Victor needed time to pull public records, search probate court archives, and trace financial histories. During those 21 days, I had to pretend everything was absolutely normal. I had to continue playing the role of the dutiful, albeit stubborn, daughter. I attended a family barbecue. I sat at the patio table, watching my father flip burgers and my mother laugh with my aunts. I watched them smile and act like a loving, supportive family. Every time my mother handed me a plate of food, a sickening thought twisted in my stomach. I looked at her manicured hands and wondered, are those the hands of a thief? Did you watch me cry over being disinherited while you stole from me? I listened to my father brag to Uncle Howard about his investment portfolio, and I wondered if my grandmother's money was sitting in his bank account while I had been eating ramen noodles to survive the winter. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. I was smiling on the outside, but inside, my mind was running 1,000 miles an hour, analyzing every childhood memory, every financial hardship, looking for the cracks in their decades-long facade. I stopped sleeping. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, hoping it was Victor, dreading it was my mother demanding the house again. The paranoia was eating me alive. I started to doubt my own sanity. Maybe Logan really was just rambling. Maybe I was spending thousands of dollars on an investigation based on a drunken idiot's hallucination. But deep down, beneath the fear and the lifelong conditioning to submit, an ember of pure, righteous anger was starting to glow hot. I was done being the shadow. I was ready to drag everything into the harsh light of day, no matter how ugly the truth turned out to be. And then, finally, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Victor called. He said, "Nora, you need to come to my office right now. And you need to bring a lawyer." Thank you for following the story this far. If you empathize with Nora, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to support us. And don't forget to leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. When Victor told me to bring a lawyer to his office, my heart dropped straight into my shoes. I called Valerie immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She rearranged her entire afternoon schedule and met me outside Victor's building. We walked into his cramped, paper-filled office together. Victor didn't offer us coffee or engage in any small talk. He just looked at me with an expression of profound pity, which terrified me more than anything else. He slid a thick, manila folder across his desk. Inside were copies of court documents, bank statements, and a copy of a will. It was my grandmother Martha's real, unedited will, pulled directly from the county probate archives. I stared at the heavily stamped pages, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. Valerie gently took the document from my hands and began to read it aloud. The truth, buried for 9 long years, was finally dragged into the light. My grandmother had not disinherited me. In fact, she had explicitly left equal trust funds for both Logan and me. The amount was exactly $200,000 each, intended to be fully accessible to us on our 25th birthdays. She had written in the margins that she hoped the money would help us buy our first homes or start businesses. It was a beautiful, loving final gesture from a woman who had adored us. But my parents, Raymond and Brenda, had legally positioned themselves as the trustees of the estate. Because I was only 22 when she died, they had full control over the accounts. Victor then produced a second set of documents, the banking records. He traced a slow, agonizingly clear path of wire transfers. Exactly on my 20th birthday, the day I was legally supposed to inherit my grandmother's gift, my parents had emptied the trust. They transferred the entire $200,000 into a private joint account under their names. From there, Victor showed how the money was slowly siphoned off in increments over the next 5 years. $5,000 here for Logan's rent. $10,000 there to pay off Logan's wrecked car. $20,000 to cover Logan's credit card debt. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there in absolute, horrifying silence. The betrayal was so vast, so incredibly deep, that my brain simply refused to process it all at once. I wasn't just upset about the money, though $200,000 would have changed my entire 20s. I was devastated by the malicious, calculated cruelty of it. My parents had sat me down, looked me directly in the eyes, and told me my beloved grandmother was deeply ashamed of me. They watched me cry. They watched me grieve a relationship I thought I had ruined. They watched me struggle to buy groceries, freeze in a house with no heating, and work myself to the bone, all while they were secretly funneling my own money to my brother so he could live in luxury. They didn't just steal my inheritance, they stole my peace of mind. They stole the memory of my grandmother's love. They engineered my poverty just to maintain their golden child's illusions. If the stolen trust fund was a knife to the chest, what Victor revealed next was a brutal twist of the blade. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses, and said that unfortunately, the theft of the inheritance wasn't the only crime they had committed. While he was digging through their financial history, he found an anomaly in their tax records. He handed Valerie another stack of papers. For the past 5 years, the exact same 5 years I was living alone, paying my own mortgage, working a full-time corporate job, and supporting myself entirely without a single dime of their help. Raymond and Brenda had been illegally claiming me as a dependent on their federal tax returns. They had been using my social security number, claiming they were providing more than half of my financial support in order to collect massive tax credits and deductions. They were writing off my existence to save themselves thousands of dollars every year. I felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea wash over me. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. It was the ultimate form of dehumanization. To my parents, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even a person. I was a financial instrument. I was a piggy bank to be smashed open for Logan, and a convenient tax loophole to keep their own bank accounts fat. Valerie's eyes were practically glowing with cold, professional fury. She looked up from the tax documents, her jaw set tight. She explained to me that stealing the trust fund was a massive civil issue, a clear breach of fiduciary duty and outright theft. But the tax situation? That was federal tax fraud. That was a criminal offense that carried severe, life-ruining penalties, including potential prison time. They had forged documents, lied to the federal government, and used my identity to do it. I sat in that chair and realized the full extent of their sociopathy. They truly believed they were untouchable. They thought I was so broken, so perfectly trained to submit and accept their abuse, that I would never dare to look into their affairs. They thought I would just exist in the background, a silent, useful tool for their family dynamic. Valerie closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. She looked at me and asked what I wanted to do. She warned me that if we pursued this, it wouldn't just be a family argument, it would be a legal bloodbath. I looked at the copies of my grandmother's signature. I thought about the nights I cried myself to sleep on a freezing floor because I thought nobody loved me. I looked Valerie in the eyes and told her to draft the countersuit. I wanted every single penny back, and I wanted them completely exposed. Before Valerie could finish drafting our massive counterattack, my parents decided to make good on their initial threat. They genuinely thought that striking first would intimidate me into immediate submission. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a busy marketing meeting at my company, sitting around a glass table with my boss and 5 colleagues. The receptionist awkwardly interrupted, saying there was a man at the front desk who insisted he had to deliver a package to me directly and refused to leave it with her. I walked out to the lobby, thoroughly confused. A man in a plain windbreaker asked if I was Nora. When I confirmed, he shoved a thick manila envelope into my chest and loudly announced, "You have been served." He turned around and walked out of the glass doors. The entire open-plan office went dead silent. Dozens of my coworkers were staring at me. The humiliation was sharp, hot, and entirely intentional. My parents had deliberately chosen to serve me at my workplace rather than my home. They wanted me embarrassed. They wanted me off balance and terrified. I walked back to my desk, my hands surprisingly steady, and opened the envelope. It was a formal lawsuit filed in the county court. The claims were absolutely absurd. My father's lawyer had written a narrative claiming that I had made a binding verbal contract to hold the house as a family asset intended for Logan, and that I was now maliciously holding family property hostage. They were seeking an immediate transfer of the deed and demanding I pay their legal fees. It was a frivolous, baseless intimidation tactic designed to bully someone who didn't know their legal rights. 5 years ago, this would have destroyed me. I would have collapsed in tears, called them begging for forgiveness, and probably signed whatever they wanted just to make the nightmare stop. But I wasn't that scared girl anymore. I had rebuilt a house from the dirt up, and I had rebuilt myself along with it. I didn't shed a single tear. I felt an eerie, freezing calm settle over my entire body. I picked up my phone, walked into an empty conference room, and called Valerie. I told her I had just been served at work. She asked if I was okay, her voice laced with concern. I looked out the window at the city skyline. I told her I was more than okay. I told her the time for waiting was over. I told her to unleash hell. Valerie's response to their lawsuit was swift, brutal, and mathematically precise. We didn't just file a standard defense, we dropped a legal nuclear bomb. Valerie filed a massive countersuit. Our filings laid out absolutely everything in excruciating detail: the original will, the stolen inheritance, the breach of fiduciary duty, and the explicit evidence of ongoing federal tax fraud. We also filed an immediate discovery request, demanding full access to all of their financial records, bank statements, and tax returns for the past decade. The moment those documents hit the public court registry, the war was officially out in the open. It didn't take long for the family grapevine to catch fire. Less than 24 hours after the countersuit was filed, the extended family group chat completely exploded. My phone buzzed so constantly it felt like it was vibrating a hole through my desk. Aunt Cynthia was the first to attack. She sent a massive paragraph asking how I could be so disgustingly vindictive, accusing me of tearing the family apart over a simple misunderstanding about a house. Uncle Howard chimed in, calling me a selfish monster who was disrespecting the parents who gave me life. Even my cousin Ian, who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, decided to weigh in, saying he always knew I was a bitter, jealous person who couldn't stand seeing Logan happy. They were all rallying around the narrative my parents had spun. Raymond and Brenda had clearly called everyone, crying victim, claiming I was suing them to steal their retirement money because I was greedy. Reading those messages, I realized how deeply the toxicity ran in our bloodline. Family loyalty, in their eyes, only meant protecting the abusers and silencing the victims. They didn't care about the truth, they only cared about maintaining the comfortable, established hierarchy where Logan was the king and I was the peasant. I sat on my couch, watching the hateful messages roll in, feeling a profound sense of detachment. They were defending criminals, and they didn't even know it. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the emotional abuse or the years of neglect. I simply typed one single response into the chat. I wrote, "Raymond and Brenda stole $200,000 of my inheritance from Grandma Martha, funneled it to Logan, and committed 5 years of federal tax fraud using my name. The bank statements and forged tax documents are currently filed with the county court. It is public record. Look it up before you defend thieves." I hit send, watched the red receipts pop up, and then I permanently left the group chat. The silence from the extended family lasted exactly 1 week. Then I received a text message from my mother, Brenda. It was dripping with fake conciliation. She said the family was hurting, that lawyers were making things unnecessarily messy, and she summoned me to their house for a family dinner to work things out in private. It was an obvious trap. It was a staged intervention designed to ambush me. They wanted to get me alone, surround me with judgmental relatives, and verbally batter me into dropping the countersuit. I agreed to go, but I wasn't going alone. On the evening of the dinner, I pulled up to my parents' wealthy suburban home, a house paid for by decades of comfortable salaries and, as I now knew, stolen money. I didn't walk to the door by myself. I was flanked by Valerie, carrying her heavy leather briefcase, and Victor, the private investigator, who looked entirely too pleased to be there. When I opened the front door and walked into the dining room, the atmosphere instantly froze. The room was packed. Aunt Cynthia, Uncle Howard, Cousin Ian, and several other relatives were sitting around the long oak table, their faces arranged in identical masks of righteous disappointment. At the head of the table sat Raymond and Brenda, looking like martyred saints. Logan sat next to them, holding the hand of his fiancée, Sierra, who looked confused by the heavy tension. Logan had a smug little smirk on his face. He actually thought I was showing up to surrender. When they saw the two strangers walking in behind me, my mother stood up, her fake smile faltering. She asked who these people were and stated that this was a private family matter. Valerie stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She introduced herself as my legal counsel and introduced Victor as the lead investigator on my case. She informed them that since there was active, high-stakes litigation involving criminal fraud allegations, her client would not be speaking to them without representation present. The silence that followed was absolute. The smug smirk completely melted off Logan's face. The relatives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, realizing this was not going to be the easy bullying session they had planned. Brenda tried to recover the narrative. She started crying, real tears rolling down her cheeks, a performance I had seen a million times. She said she couldn't believe I would bring strangers into their home, that family should forgive each other, and that I was breaking her heart. I didn't even blink. I didn't sit down. I stood at the end of the table and looked her dead in the eye. I told her to stop acting. I offered them one final, non-negotiable ultimatum. I told them they had exactly 48 hours to drop their frivolous lawsuit, return my $200,000 with 9 years of interest, and file amended tax returns with the IRS. If they did that, I would consider dropping the civil suit. My father exploded. He slammed his fists on the table, his face turning an angry purple. He yelled, asking how dare I come into his house and demand money. He screamed that I was ungrateful. Logan stood up, puffing his chest out, yelling that I was trying to ruin his wedding, that he needed the house, and that I was just a bitter loser. I looked at Logan with pure disgust. I asked him why he needed my house so badly. I asked him if it was because he had already burned through his $200,000, plus whatever our parents stole from me, and was too much of a coward to tell his fiancée that he was completely broke. Sierra turned pale. She dropped Logan's hand and asked what I was talking about. That was the cue. I nodded at Victor. Victor stepped up to the dining table, opened his heavy briefcase, and pulled out thick stacks of paper. He dropped them onto the polished oak wood with a heavy, satisfying thud. He announced clearly to the entire room that these were the financial records. He stated that Raymond and Brenda received $200,000 from Martha's trust intended solely for Nora, and that the money was illegally dispersed into accounts controlled by Logan. He then dropped the forged tax documents next to the bank statements. Absolute chaos erupted. Aunt Cynthia grabbed a bank statement, her eyes widening as she read the highlighted wire transfers. Uncle Howard started stuttering. Sierra stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, looking at Logan with horror. My parents just froze, the righteous anger completely draining from their faces, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization that they were completely trapped. I looked at the relatives who had called me a monster. I asked them where their family loyalty was when my parents were stealing my future. I looked at my mother and father, completely broken. I told them the clock was ticking, turned around, and walked out of the house, leaving their empire of lies burning to the ground behind me. The fallout from that dinner was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. I didn't even make it halfway back to my house before I received a text message from Sierra. She had walked out of my parents' house right behind me. The text simply said, "Thank you for exposing the truth." He told me his trust fund was tied up in long-term property investments. I almost married a fraud. The engagement was officially broken that night. Logan's carefully constructed world of luxury, built entirely on my stolen inheritance, collapsed in a matter of hours. Without Sierra's income, and without my parents' ability to bail him out, because their assets were now frozen by the impending lawsuit, he was completely exposed. Faced with the undeniable, documented proof of their crimes laid out before the entire family, my parents' bravado completely vanished. They dropped their ridiculous lawsuit against me within 24 hours. They hired a frantic defense attorney who immediately reached out to Valerie, begging to negotiate a settlement to keep the matter out of a public trial. But Valerie was a shark who smelled blood in the water, and she had my full authorization to be utterly merciless. We rejected their first 3 lowball offers without even reading past the first page. Eventually, their lawyer had to explain to them that they had zero leverage. We forced them into an airtight, ironclad settlement agreement. They were legally bound to repay the original $200,000, plus 9 years of compounding interest, plus every single cent of my legal and investigation fees. Furthermore, Valerie drafted a strict, permanent no-contact order. They were legally barred from calling me, texting me, or approaching my property. If they violated it, the agreement stipulated immediate financial penalties. They signed the documents in a sterile conference room. They didn't look at me once. They looked older, smaller, and utterly defeated. The golden child was ruined, and the abusive parents were finally facing the consequences of their greed. While the civil settlement returned my money, it was the federal government that delivered the ultimate punishment. Because we had mandated that they file amended tax returns as part of our settlement, it triggered an immediate, aggressive audit by the IRS. The government does not look kindly upon individuals who forge dependents to steal tax credits for half a decade. The financial penalties levied against Raymond and Brenda were catastrophic. They were hit with massive back taxes, fraud penalties, and exorbitant interest fees that wiped out whatever savings they had left after paying my settlement. The lifestyle they had maintained, the wealthy suburban facade they had used to judge me and prop up Logan, shattered completely. To pay the federal government and avoid prison time, they were forced to put their large, beautiful house on the market. It sold quickly, but all the equity went straight to the IRS. I drove by their neighborhood once, purely out of curiosity, and saw the moving trucks loading up their expensive furniture. They had to downsize dramatically. They moved into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment in a much less desirable part of town. Their retirement plans were essentially destroyed. And because poetic justice is sometimes perfectly orchestrated, Logan, having lost his luxury downtown apartment after Sierra left him, was forced to move back in with them. The 3 of them, the architects of my misery, were now trapped in a tiny apartment together, suffocating in the consequences of their own toxic relationship. The relatives who had blindly supported them slowly distanced themselves, embarrassed by the scandal. My parents had tried to bankrupt me and steal my home. Instead, they had bankrupted themselves and lost everything they valued. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, the dust had finally settled. I was sitting on the back porch of my beautiful, restored home, drinking coffee and looking out at the garden I had cultivated from dirt. The peace I felt was profound. Then I received a certified letter in the mail. It was from an estate attorney representing my late grandmother, Martha. He explained that after seeing the public records of the lawsuit and the revelation of the stolen trust, he was authorized to release a secondary, secret asset to me. Inside the envelope was a copy of my grandmother's personal journal, dated just a few weeks before she passed away. The handwriting was shaky but clear. She had written that she feared Raymond and Brenda would try to control my inheritance because they had always resented my independence. She wrote that she saw exactly who I was, a builder, a survivor. Along with the journal was the documentation for a separate, private account she had set up entirely outside the main estate, completely hidden from my parents. The account had grown over the last decade to nearly $50,000. It was her final, protective embrace from beyond the grave. She had known. Somehow, she had always known. I used that $50,000 to completely pay off the remaining small loans I had taken out for the house repairs, and I used the rest to build a stunning, glass greenhouse in my backyard, something I had dreamed about since I first bought the property. My house stands now as more than just real estate. It is a monument to survival. It proves that the family you are born into does not have to dictate the life you live. I cut the rot out of my life, and in doing so, I made room for everything to bloom. I look at the garden I built with my own hands, funded by the secret blessing my grandmother left me. I know my parents are living in a cramped apartment, financially ruined, while my brother's life fell apart because of his own lies. Sometimes, I still get voicemails from distant relatives saying I went too far, that a lawsuit was a mistake, and that I should have handled it as a family. But after everything they stole from me, my money, my trust, and almost my home, am I wrong for letting them destroy themselves, or should I have shown them the mercy they never showed me? Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button to join our storytelling family. Don't forget to leave your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one of them. See you in the next drama.